Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session focused on the FDA's role in the management of the crisis. My name is Ravi Thadhani. I'm the Chief Academic Officer of Mass General Brigham, and it's a pleasure this afternoon to be accompanied by two distinguished guests, Amy Abernethy, who's the Principal Deputy Commissioner at the FDA. Welcome, Amy, and thank you for everything you do at the FDA.
Thank you.
And I'm also accompanied by Lindsey Baden, who's the director for the Center for Clinical Investigation at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Lindsey, thank you for joining. First, I'll say that although the chairs appear empty, I am assured that there's a large audience, so welcome to the large audience here. I also will use this as an opportunity to compare and contrast, and that is, this morning you heard extensively from industry, from security experts, from academics. This is actually one of the first sessions where we have the pleasure and actually the honor to have the FDA represented at this particular meeting. So it's really terrific to be able to chair this. So let's begin. The FDA's role in management of this crisis. Let me turn to Amy to gain your insights from the FDA's perspective on the past, present, and future in this particular issue, the management of this crisis and the role of government, in this case, the FDA.
So as I reflect on what I've been observing, what I've been a part of over the last several months, I see a number of aspects of how the FDA has a direct role, but also all of government. And we need to simultaneously balance the need to be able to move fast and make sure that clinicians, that drug developers, that vaccine developers have the tools that they need, while also making sure that we are continuing to maintain the right balance of the standards that we expect. And so, my observation has been that we have a tool suite. And so, for example, we have tools that can be put in place in a context of emergency, such as the ability to issue emergency use authorizations and updated guidances. And those tools give us the ability to create more regulatory flexibility. And then meanwhile, we have the ability to continue to monitor what's happening as the pandemic unfolds. And those tools have been put in place to see, do we need to add more, for example, emergency guidances, or pull back? And so importantly, the task is to make sure that we move as quickly as possible, but do so in a judicious way that's constantly being right-sized.
Yeah, that's great. I think you touched on some key points, the flexibility, the sort of nimbleness, and over time, of course, as we learn to improve the sort of precision, if you will. Maybe give us an example of to make it more concrete to the audience in terms of how that was done.
So I'll take two examples. One that I think stares us in the face every day, which is diagnostic testing. And so as we at FDA and across government and really across all of healthcare realized we had a challenge within the context of diagnostic testing. One of the critical tasks was to figure out how do we allow for more diagnostic tests to get on market and be able to get into the hands of clinicians to be used for real people. So with that, there was the issuance of an emergency use authorization. And so around, for example, the 16th of March to allow emergency use EUA for the development of diagnostics. But then as we watched tests come onto the market, for example, in the context of serology tests, we realized, wait a second, this availability actually has some negative context, especially of serology tests that do not have the sensitivity and specificity that we would all expect. Mm. And therefore, we pulled back that EUA and issued a new amended EUA on, I think it was March 5th or so, May 5th, excuse me, that basically specified that if you're going to have a serology test in the market, you need to now send to the FDA your information about sensitivity and specificity within 10 days. That's an example of how first there was regulatory flexibility, and then as we observed what was taking place, we pulled back. I think the second example is within the context of hydroxychloroquine. So here was an area where there was lack of any effective COVID-19 specific drugs on the market, a set of questions and data sets suggesting that hydroxychloroquine may have a role for people with COVID-19, an EUA that was issued near the end of March that basically specifies for people who are in the hospital with COVID-19, they have access to hydroxychloroquine, and now continuing to monitor, and you've seen already one edit to that in EUA, amplifying the message around the cardiac risks, and continuing to monitor now that remdesivir has come to market, and also understanding more about safety and effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine, what that may allow us to think over time. We're certainly waiting for the clinical trials around hydroxychloroquine. We're all continuously monitoring the data.
And yeah, that's great. That's great. That's sort of key examples. And actually, I'm going to turn to Lindsey. On the receiving end, you manage an innovative Center for Clinical Investigation. You've put forward, obviously, a suite of different studies at our own healthcare system based on what Amy had highlighted in terms of their flexibility and nimbleness. How was it sort of on the receiving end to sort of implement studies?
I mean, I think that putting in perspective what has transpired in 4 months, this is a virus that we were unaware of and had limited to no associated human disease. And the virus was identified, the sequence provided just in the beginning of January. So that over the course of 4 months, not only have we had to develop diagnostics to diagnose this, understand transmissibility, global spread, understand potential disease associated with it, and then potentially therapies to treat it. And I think the FDA and oversight bodies have had an incredibly challenging job to be flexible, to allow us to develop the techniques needed to clinically define this disease, and to also start developing therapies to treat it. And Ravi, as you suggest, doing this in real time, we're building the airplane as we're flying it, as many have said before, and we can't wait to take off. The disease was spreading like a respiratory virus, and I think the agency has been incredibly flexible to allow innovation. And as a practitioner taking care of patients and an investigator developing therapies, it's been incredibly difficult because when one has sick patients, we want to treat them. And we have to remember that the desire to treat does not mean the treatment is effective and without side effect, and how to do both in real time at this simultaneously. And I think the agency and other oversight bodies have worked very hard to allow this. What we as a community of practitioners and researchers need to do is to realize as new data emerge, we will recalibrate what we think these treatments and these diagnostics can do, which is a little bit different than what we're used to. We're used to years of development, high quality phase 3 trials, carefully choreographed endpoints, carefully analyzed data, carefully debated meaning across multiple studies, and then a regulatory review approval with a label with lots of detail. That is not what we have here. And so I think our expectations have to also be balanced with the reality of the event that we're responding to. And I applaud the agency for being flexible. And I think we as a community with the agency have to work back and forth to get it right and to right size it, as Amy has suggested.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsey. That's great. And what you highlight is something that we've seen emerge as a result of this crisis, and that is coordination, communication. We've participated, as you know all too well, Lindsey, in a number of webinars and dissecting the communication that comes out of the agency in real time to figure out how do we pivot from study design A to study design B. Amy, I'm wondering from your standpoint if you can just comment on sort of what the agency has learned about sort of better coordination with academics, potentially better coordination, if you will, with other government agencies in terms of helping with the sort of bigger mission.
So, I think I've seen better coordination happen in 2 ways. The first is, as you think about managing something like a pandemic, we need to simultaneously develop diagnostics, vaccines, drugs. We need to make sure that we can take care of patients in the here and now as we're waiting for all of these to come out. And so I think there's been better coordination in just understanding how those have to happen in lockstep, which is then also coincided with now a better understanding or coordination in what I call portfolio thinking, which is to recognize that you need pipelines in each of these spaces, and you need to be able to prioritize what is really going to be sort of essentially the best first shots on goal and start working your way through the development of the therapeutics pipeline, the development of the vaccine pipeline, for example. And that requires really a coordinated response between government, with academia, with manufacturers and industry, so that we can move as quickly as possible. And what I've started to see happen for the first time ever since I've been at the agency, which has only been a year, but I've been watching the agency for much longer than that,
right.
is this sort of very coordinated portfolio thinking, really trying to ask, how do we attend to that which we should do first to make sure we allocate our clinical trial resources there, to make sure we're collecting the right data, to make sure it's the best opportunity to come to real resolution for patients.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I'm going to pick up on something you said to me earlier in a previous conversation, and that is how your background in oncology and its role sort of in coordination, but also in real-time kind of urgency of doing studies, and dovetail that with something that Lindsey said, and that is, we're trying to fly and learn how to fly at the same time, but this idea that, there are examples in our academic / federal community where urgency and clinical trial management and pivoting quickly is of utmost importance, if not the standard, if you will. And I'm going to ask both of you to sort of comment on perhaps lessons on oncology and how that translates to infectious diseases.
So as you've alluded, I'm an oncologist by background, and I have been reflecting recently that my experiences within the context of COVID-19 feel very much like my experiences within oncology, where we need to constantly be learning from every patient, so that we simultaneously ask, how can we have as many people involved in coordinated, systematic clinical trial protocols as possible, but also for individuals who are outside of traditional clinical trial settings, how do we make sure we're also learning from their story in a coordinated way, and then marrying those two kinds of data sets together. You saw this happen, for example, in pediatric oncology with the development of continuous learning protocols, some of which were formal clinical trials and some observational studies. And I think what we're seeing in COVID-19 is both the clinical trial pipeline really starting to be developed and move forward, and that being partnered with what we're learning from real-world data of all kinds of different systems, so that we're actually starting to think about how we learn from every patient.
Yeah. Lindsey, just as you comment on that, I also want you, if you don't mind, to touch on what we learn not only in oncology, but also how you in this organization has led the organization to say, look, we need to get trials up and running within a short period of time. We need to get those contracts done. We need to make sure the regulatory checkboxes are done. And how has that sort of guidance from the FDA in conjunction with what you've seen sort of helped you?
Well, I mean, I think that part of it is what you're getting at, Ravi, and what Amy, you have commented on, is this can't be business as usual. This virus is spreading like a respiratory virus, full stop. And it is spread globally, dramatically in weeks. And we have to rejigger our response. And I think we learned some about this 8 years ago with the Ebola event in West Africa, where clinical trials in the middle of a pandemic were developed and it took months. Now we're in a position where we're developing clinical trials for a pandemic in weeks, but that's still too slow. Having said that, it's better than we've ever done it before as a community, but we need to then look at that and say, can we do it even better? And as you say, Ravi, the agency has to allow studies to go forward, but companies and investigators have to ideate the ideas. The institutions have to allow them. The IRBs have to review them. The patients have to be appropriately phenotyped and diagnosed. So therefore, you need diagnostics. So it's all interdigitated. But I think we as a community in this event have done it faster than ever before. But I think we have to take a good hard look at how do we do it faster, because we had a condition that had no known effective treatment with a high morbidity, particularly in key populations. And all of us, or many in the community, have moved extremely quickly across all of those domains, including the agency, to facilitate studies being launched. And I think remdesivir is an example. Hydroxychloroquine, as Amy suggested, is an example that was used clinically a la carte. Very challenging to understand risk-benefit in that setting. Remdesivir was taken off the shelf and used in a systematic way, and data were generated that suggest activity. And as we have already talked about, the speed of everything is such where those data are still not fully available. They're available to the DSMB, to the agency, to key bodies. We all look forward to more data being available, but I think that speaks to the speed with which we're moving and how best to communicate accurately when we're moving this fast across so many domains.
Yeah. And I want to take what you said and just emphasize another point, and that is the partnership. In other words, the speed and the sort of alacrity is a dual mandate. In other words, the agency, the academics, I'm assuming, of course, industry and so forth. I want to come back to Amy on this particular point. We've learned a lot, tremendous amount. The FDA has learned a lot. Academics has learned a lot. I hate to say this, but of course, the other part of the title of this session is how do we prepare for the next one? Heaven forbid that we even begin to talk about that. I'm actually stuttering while I'm even mentioning this. But that said, I'm sure you've thought about this, Amy, and what are your thoughts in sort of the future and how we can better prepare?
So there's the elements of COVID-19, the disease. I'm going to put that over there because I think we have a lot in drawing a picture of the disease. But there are some fundamentals that I feel like we're learning. So first is common tools. So one of the things that's made process more efficient is developing, for example, common sets of data elements that allow now the ability to start to think about more efficient study designs where we have common data elements, perhaps also being able to be more efficient for meta-analysis across studies in the future, et cetera. So one kind of area that I think we need to be learning is in what are the tool suites that are allowing us to go fast now, and what can we do to supercharge them in the future? Another example is, for example, being better at having learning from each other in terms of study protocols, study designs, so that again, we can keep building on things as opposed to doing differently. Another example of tool suites is we need to learn how to do platform trials. We need to be able to systematically evaluate several things at the same time. Another area that I think we're learning a lot is how do we use data sets all around us, especially the electronic health record, to inform what's going on, both from the standpoint of the natural history of the disease, as well as to, again, as I sort of described it, right-sized decision-making as we go along the way. I think the other thing that I would like to hit on before I turn it over to Lindsey is we've learned how to let a lot of aspects of competition blur into the background in the middle of managing COVID-19. And we need to figure out which of those aspects that when they blurred into the background really made us a lot more efficient, both in terms of spirit of community, but also in getting things done so that we figure out how to let that happen again.
Yeah, and Lindsey, just one comment. What I failed to mention at Amy's introduction is she's also the acting Chief Information Officer at the FDA and has a tremendous amount of experience in big data and artificial intelligence and so forth. So I like the way you sort of pull that as another tool, if you will, in sort of this collaborative response. I'm sorry, Lindsey, go ahead.
No, and I think, Amy, as you said, we're in this together and responding together as individuals, but also as industry, government oversight, academia, as providers, as potentially patients. We really are in this together. And we also have to think about, we're in this together globally. And I think you hit on that, Amy, when you said the tool sets being developed. And I think the WHO developing a common endpoint, very crude, but very effective, that can be used in all environments. The agency, the CDC, the NIH adapting that so that we're able to develop a response that is globally relevant and globally applicable and not just in environments with the latest technology. And I think thinking about this as a really global collective is necessary for these types of infectious diseases that we've experienced in the past and likely to experience in the future.
The one thing, I couldn't agree more, Lindsey. The one thing I will say, and I hadn't actually done this before, but my communications with the agency have yielded immediate responses, but not only responses, I would say, that have helped us quite a bit in our own organization, Amy, but also responses like Sharon gave me the other day, and that is, we want to learn what you're actually doing and collect data. While you collect data, share those with us so we can actually adapt. In other words, it's a bilateral sort of nimbleness that is being sought after. Any comments on that?
I comment on a couple of things. You were asking before about what kinds of things have we learned. Well, we've learned what things do we need to put in place to move fast. So, for example, we have a 24-hour hotline that you can call if you're trying to develop to submit an EUA or sort of you want to develop something. So we've learned how to communicate more efficiently. We've also started to realize what we didn't know about what was going on and figuring out how to embed that kind of questioning in everything that we do, as you alluded to, for example, with your conversations with Jeff Shern. And I think, and I sincerely hope that post-pandemic, what you're going to see is enduring understanding of what's working and what doesn't work as it relates to our regulatory flexibility and speed that we can then continue into the future. And I suspect this is going to be one of those areas is how we have learned to essentially understand what's going on in near real time so that it informs us inside the agency to be ready for what's coming.
And we have to allow you to recalibrate, which is something that we as a community have to be more accepting of and encouraging.
Well, the precedent,
it's hard, but it's important.
Yeah, the precedent is certainly being set. So I apologize. We've come to the end of our time. I want to once again thank Amy for her service as well as her participation, and Lindsey for all the amazing work you continue to do.